Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome to our closing lecture. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Gillian Russell. Gillian is a professor in the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University, and she's also a visiting fellow in the Arche Research Center at the University of St. Andrews. Her research focuses particularly on issues in the philosophy of logic, as, for example, topics on the epistemology and normativity of logic. She works on logic and indexicals, logical pluralism, logical nihilism, and on feminist logic. She has published numerous significant and highly regarded works on these topics. And of course, I cannot mention all of her publications here. I just want to mention her most recent book, which is titled Barriers to Entailment, published in 2023 by Oxford University Press. And this book is about barriers which are supposed to prevent certain premises from leading to conclusions in a logically valid argument, such as, for example, the is-ought barrier in Hume's law. And Gillian's talk today is being held, as I said, as the closing lecture of GAP 12, and its title is Logic for Virtual Worlds. So we are very pleased that you are here, Gillian, and we are looking forward to your talk. Please come.
Danke sehr, Elke. Can you hear me okay? Ich wollte am Anfang ein paar Wörter auf Deutsch sagen. Und nämlich, dass ich mich freue, wieder in Deutschland zu sein, wieder bei der GAP. Letztes Mal für mich war es Osnabrück, glaube ich. Aber diese Woche in Düsseldorf habe ich viele interessante Vorträge gehört und viele wunderbare Menschen kennengelernt. Und für mich, heute Abend hier zu sprechen, ist eine fantastische Gelegenheit. Also ich bedanke mich. Thank you. Leider ist mein Deutsch nicht so gut, dass ich den gesamten Vortrag auf Deutsch schaffen kann. And so from now on, I'll be speaking in English. Maybe for all the international visitors, that's a good thing anyway. So, logic for virtual worlds. In two dogmas of empiricism, so that means in 1951, when it was first published, but also in the 10 years leading up to that date, when Quine was giving the material from that paper in talks, Quine argued that there could be empirical grounds to revise logic. And in arguing for this, he was going against what at the time was the dominant view, which was that there were two different kinds of truth. There were the everyday or scientific claims that would be established through observation or experiments. They would be synthetic, they would be contingent. And then there would be this other group of truths, the logical truths, the mathematical truths. They would not be established on the basis of experience. Maybe it would be proof or some other a priori method, and then they would be necessary. And against this, Quine argues that you should think of all the beliefs you have about the world or your entire theory of the world as one big web that's all interconnected. And if there's some experience that doesn't fit with that set of beliefs, then there'll be lots of different ways that you could change it. You will generally try to do it in a way that, say, preserves simplicity or changes it as little as possible. Sometimes the metaphor of minimum mutilation is thrown around. But one of the thoughts is that claims in logic, claims in mathematics, changing those would cause so much disruption in the web that we are really unlikely to change them in response to experience. And Quine is suggesting that we made a mistake in thinking that these are different in kind. Really, they're just different in degree. They're very unlikely to be revised in response to experience. But in principle, they can be. Okay, so that raises a question, namely, what kind of experience could cause you to change your logic, and what would you change it to? What would that look like? So what kind of observations would make us revise logic? What logic should we move to? For a long time, the most promising answer to this question was thought to involve quantum mechanics. So, results from physics that are very general, very strange, very surprising. Maybe that's the kind of thing that could cause you to change your logic. And then how should you change it? Well, Birkhoff and von Neumann suggested a non-distributive logic, one that invalidates various distributive principles. And this suggestion was endorsed by Hilary Putnam in his paper, Is Logic Empirical? So here's a quote from Quine from Two Dogmas. He says, "Revision, even of the law of excluded middle, has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics. And what difference is there in principle between such a shift and the shift whereby Kepler superseded Ptolemy, or Einstein Newton, or Darwin Aristotle?" So this is in 51. He seems quite taken by the idea that maybe this could be the empirical reason to change logic. But in the Philosophy of Logic, so now in 1986, he is unconvinced and has kind of backed off from this suggestion. He says, whatever the technical merits of the case, I would cite again the maxim of minimum mutilation as a deterring consideration. I do place the claims of physics somewhat above those of set theory. It's a question of remoteness from the data of observation. Physics is less remote than set theory. But in any event, let us not underestimate the price of a deviant logic. The price is perhaps not quite prohibitive, but the returns had better be good. Okay. These days, there's likely to be a lot of people sitting in the audience who think, wait a minute, aren't there lots of logicians who want to change and move away from classical logic? And of course, there are. But often, the reason they think we should move away from classical logic is not especially empirical. Right? It's not about some particular observations that have been made. So for example, the motivations might be things like paradoxes in set theory. Maybe it's semantic paradoxes, the liar paradox, or the Soriades. Sometimes people have particular views about the relationship between quantification and existence, and so they might advocate for a free logic on that basis. Sometimes people have particular views in the philosophy of mathematics that push them towards, say, an intuitionistic logic. And sometimes they have views about God that might motivate them to say that, say, the logic of first-degree entailment is the one true logic. But each of these approaches is compatible with the idea that the new logic was a priori knowable all along. It's not that we had some weird experience that made us think, oh, now we need a new logic. Rather, we made a mistake in the a priori process of getting to classical logic. And once we've thought hard enough about, say, the liar paradox, about the metaphysics of mathematics, then we'll realize that we made that mistake and we'll get the logic right. Okay, it's very different from the quantum mechanics approach where, new results in physics are telling us what to go with. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that the quantum mechanics should make us change our logic view. Did not receive very much uptake, perhaps with Hilary Putnam as the main exception. And that leaves us with the question, if the evidence for quantum mechanics wasn't enough to motivate empirical revision of logic, could anything be? And today, I want to answer for a pair of answers to the following questions. So question one, what experiences, if any, could give us reason to revise logic? And question two, what is the new logic going to be? Okay, so my answers are, experiences had in virtual reality give us reason to revise our logic, and the new logic should be an assessment-sensitive one in the sense of John McFarlane's work on relativism. Okay, so here is where we're going. At the beginning, there's a section about empirical epistemology and logic. You've just had that section. Then I'm going to talk about virtual reality, what that is. I'm assuming, to be honest, that there's at least some people in the audience who don't really know what virtual reality is. Can I ask you to raise your hand if you've ever tried virtual reality? Okay. I feel like that's about half the audience, which is sort of consistent with my experiences so far. So I'm going to be assuming that at least some people in the audience don't yet really know what I'm talking about, and I need to say something about that. Then in section 3, I'm going to talk a bit about what assessment sensitivity is and how it might be connected to non-standard logics. And I'll talk about two logics in particular, Łukasiewicz's logic, L3, and Kaplan's logic, LD, but I'm going to suggest that neither of these are the logic that we need. It's worth going through them anyway, because we need some of the pieces that will come up. And then in section 4, I'm actually going to give you some positive stuff, some suggestions about how this logic should go. There will be a little bit of what is technically called hair in those sections, meaning there will be some symbols, there will be some truth conditions that will go by a little fast, but what I'm aiming to do is give you some sense of like why it would make a difference to the logic, so that you can see at least that there's something interesting worth pursuing here. And in the last section, section 5, I'm going to step back to much bigger picture to do with the metaphysics of virtual reality in order to finish. Okay, so virtual reality and relativism. So at the moment in 2025, if you want to experience virtual reality, you need a headset in order to do it. So what that looks like is like a heavy pair of goggles or glasses that you pull on over your eyes. They're opaque, so you can't see through them. And there might be like some headphones or a speaker that goes next to your ear. Ideally, if I wanted to help you see what virtual reality is like, I would just give you all a headset and you could try it out for the next 10 minutes and get some sort of sense for it. But I can't do that. So I'm going to need to ask you to use your imagination when I try to explain to you what it would be like to pull on a VR headset. And I'm going to give you a little story about what it might be like. Normally I just read this out, but I've been going to a few talks in German this week, and one thing that I realized is it's way easier to follow text if you can see it written out as well as hear somebody say it. So I've put the story on my slides to make it a little bit easier to follow. Okay, so you've got your headset. Before you put the headset on, you are standing in a familiar, sparsely furnished room. Perhaps your living room, with the furniture pushed back against the walls. When you look around, you can see the room. Perhaps you can see where the carpet meets the wall a few feet away, the edge of a coffee table, pictures on the walls, and the sunlight hitting them from your eye-level living room window. You can hear people walking past in the street outside. Then you close your eyes and you pull on the VR headset. And when you open them again, things are visually and hourly different. It appears to you as if you're in a much larger space, in the middle of a warehouse. And the walls are further away, the ceiling much higher, the floor is concrete, not carpet, and the light comes from overhead skylights instead of the living room window. When you turn around, you can see the rear of the warehouse is open to a forest behind you. Taking a step towards the forest, you realize you can no longer hear people walking past outside, but instead, the sound of dirt bike engines revving, and in the background, rising electronic music. Your life now has a soundtrack, and not only in your head. In a lot of ways, when you first put on a VR headset, it feels a little bit as if you were like instantly teletransported to a new location in the real world. Like now you're in a new place. But there are some ways in which VR goes a bit beyond that, because it's not just the environment around you that can change, your physical body can change as well. Okay. So you look down at your own body and see that you are wearing red motorcycle leathers, clothing you did not think you possessed. You bring your hand up before your eyes and see that it has become a blue claw with long yellow talons, like a bird. You can control the claw just like you normally do your hand. So you clench your fist and the claw clenches, clap your hands together, and suddenly your claw hand holds a white gun with the text reading laser on the side. Twitch your index finger and the gun fires red light, making a pew, pew sound, and blowing a noisy hole in the warehouse wall. Outside, the ground shakes, the light shifts, and an enormous angry eye looks at you through the hole you just made. Uh-oh. Okay, so in some ways, entering VR is like moving instantly to a new place in the real world, as if you fainted at school and then you woke up in the nurse's office, or you're abducted by aliens and they chloroform you and you wake up on the spaceship and now you're somewhere new. But there are other ways in which VR is different from like moving to a new place. And I want to stress 3 of these. So the first one is that in 2025, VR has various technological limitations. So for example, it is primarily a visual experience with sound, but when it comes to like tactile feedback, you don't get as much detail. So a lot of VR setups come with like a hand thing that you can hold, and it can vibrate in response to various things. So if you push a button, sometimes the handset will like vibrate and it feels like more physical because of that vibration. Or if you shoot a gun, it might vibrate then. And some people have haptic vests, so that if you were, say, playing paintball with somebody in virtual reality and you got shot with a paint gun, then you would feel the vibration and you'd be able to tell that you had been shot. But you can't feel like the breeze in your hair. You can't sort of reach down and touch the concrete and have it feel like concrete instead of the carpet in your living room. There aren't usually smells that come with VR, so there's no olfactory virtual reality. Yeah, I think we can expect many of these limitations to fade away in the near future. So, I mean, a limitation I meant to mention was that sometimes the headset is kind of heavy. And so you really notice it. It can be uncomfortable to be in VR for a long time. But we can expect headsets to get a lot smaller, to eventually be more like a pair of glasses that you put on, and maybe eventually like putting in a pair of contact lenses. And then you can like step into VR through activating your contact lenses. Perhaps even eventually, it'll be able to work through direct neural stimulation, so that we can also have VR for smells and a richer tactile feedback for VR. And the possibility that I think is most terrifying and futuristic is that maybe we'd be able to simulate memory. So imagine that when you step into VR, you could create new memories, about what character you are, what you do, but also maybe take away some of your old memories. If you think about what our everyday experience is like with dreams, where when you wake up from a dream, for the first few seconds, you can remember it really well. 2 minutes later, it's mostly gone. Half an hour later, you can't remember anything. If it was possible to do that with VR experiences and simulate memories that way, that would be an even richer experience. Okay, here's another way in which VR is not like moving to a new place in the real world. You're still dependent on the real world. So if you have not pushed your coffee table far enough away, or if your dog is still in the living room, then even though they're not in the virtual space, you can still trip over them. Right? The real world is still there. And my favorite example for this is, imagine that the government of New Zealand has become very worried about nuclear weapons, and they want to know how to protect New Zealand citizens from nuclear war. And somebody suggests, well, let's start a colony on Mars. We'll send the New Zealand citizens to Mars, then they'll be safe from nuclear proliferation on Earth. And the opposition say, that sounds really expensive. How about we create a nuclear-free colony in virtual reality? Right? We'll put the New Zealand citizens in virtual reality, right? And there's no nuclear weapons in there, so they'll be safe. But of course, right, they're not safe. You're still in the real world if you're in virtual reality, and so still dependent on it. Okay, the last way in which VR is different from moving to a new place is the one that I want to focus on in this talk. It becomes most obvious in situations where VR is social. So you can meet up with your friends in virtual reality. They need a headset as well, but they don't need to be with you. So you could be in Dusseldorf, they could be in Sydney, but they put on their headset and they tell it to take them to the warehouse where you are, and then they appear in the warehouse. Or as we normally say it, their avatar appears in the warehouse. And now there's this question, is the avatar them? Right? It doesn't have to look like your friend, right? It could look like a monster, it could look like an animal, but when your friend raises their hand in Sydney, the monster in the warehouse raises their arm, raises their claw. And when your friend speaks in Sydney, in the warehouse, you hear them talking to you and their mouth moving. And you can do all kinds of things together, right? So you could play tennis. You could both have a racket and hit the ball back and forth. You could work on a philosophy paper together. You could create a three-dimensional sculpture, make paper airplanes and throw them around. But sometimes when you're doing social things in VR, VR surprises you. So this is a real example. I was in virtual reality with a bunch of philosophers during the pandemic. And we were exploring a field. So we were walking around this field, and in the field, there are a lot of hot air balloons. Right? And you can go up to the hot air balloons and you can get into the basket. And every few minutes or so, the hot air balloons rise up into the sky. And if you're in the basket when that happens, then you go up with them and you can see a beautiful view over the landscape. And a few minutes later, the balloons all come down. You can get out again, wander around. And so the group of philosophers were all playing, trying out the balloons, walking around the field. And we gradually realize that the balloons are not up in the air at the same time for everyone. So somebody says, oh, look, the balloons are going up again. And somebody else says, what are you talking about? They've been up for the last 2 minutes. Right? And we gradually realize that the experience is just not synced for us in this way, that sometimes when one of us looks at the balloons and judges the distance from the bottom of the basket to the ground, it looks about 200 meters. And when somebody else judges the distance from the bottom of the basket to the ground, it's 0 meters. It's on the ground. This is really weird. This is something that I think doesn't happen in the real world. If one of you thought the balloon was 200 meters in the air and the other one thought it was on the ground, something has gone wrong, right? One of you's hallucinating or doesn't understand the language or is confused in some way. But in virtual reality, you don't have to be confused. You don't have to be misunderstanding the language or hallucinating for this to happen. Right? The balloon really can be up for one person and down for somebody else. Okay. So my last way in which I think virtual reality is different from just moving to another place is that you can have this kind of relativism about a virtual world that I don't think you get in the real world. So here's an example that I'm going to use a lot, right? It takes too long to explain the whole thing about the distance between the ground and the bottom of the balloon is so many meters. So instead of talking about that distance, I'm just going to talk about the color of the balloon because it gives me shorter sentences. And I'm going to be particularly interested in this sentence 1. Balloon A is red. Here's balloon A. This is not a color picture, so you can't tell what color it is. But in virtual reality, balloon A is red for this guy, Cal, but not red, and in fact blue for Dingo. Okay? Let's see. Okay. We thought that this weird thing with the distance between the balloon and the ground was probably just an accident in the virtual world that we were playing in. But this kind of relativity doesn't have to be an accident, and you might try to bring it about on purpose for various reasons. So here are some examples. 1, if you are hard of hearing, or perhaps more likely, if everybody else has started mumbling, you might decide to turn on subtitles so that whenever anyone speaks in virtual reality, you can see the text of what they're saying. Right? And then it doesn't matter that they're mumbling, you'll still be able to figure out what they're saying. Or if I go to a museum or a gallery with a friend and we have different first languages, we could have the signs in the museum appear in different languages to each of us. So my friend speaks Japanese, and so she sees the signs in Japanese. I see them in English. But then questions like, how many letter A's appear on this sign? Or how many kanji are there on this sign are going to be different for different people. These, I think, are both quite beneficial examples. They're examples that we really might think, well, this is a great thing about VR, that you can have these features. Here's one that is not so nice. So sometimes advertisers target their adverts, and they want particular people to be exposed to particular persuasive techniques. You could have this thing in a supermarket in VR where you're walking around the supermarket doing your shopping. It's like shopping online, except that you actually get to walk around and look at everything and pick things up and read stuff. But advertisers can pay to have certain things just look a bit better to certain people. So the colors might be a little bit brighter, the text might be a little bit clearer, the image just a bit sharper, right? Such that you might even really not know why, but one product just looks a bit better to you, right? And this could be something that influences your behavior, even if you aren't aware that this is happening. Okay. All right, so what I've been trying to suggest is that objects in VR can instantiate properties in a person-relative way. So balloon A can be red for Cal, but not red for Dingo. And we might want to think, especially if we're going to think about logic, about what that means for the truth values of things like propositions and sentences. So here are just a few preliminary thoughts about how we might think about this. I'm not really arguing for it, I'm just saying try thinking about it this way. Okay. So first of all, it seems likely that propositions would get person-relative truth values. So think of a proposition like this one. This is a very simple Russellian proposition. It contains balloon A, the object, and also the property of being read. Right? Seems like that proposition is going to be true relative to Cal, but false relative to Dingo. Okay. And then if propositions get person-relative truth values, we can think about what that would mean for sentences that express those propositions. Right? So this time take the sentence, in quotation marks, balloon A is red. That, you might think, expresses the proposition that balloon A is red. So it expresses a proposition which is true relative to Cal, but false relative to Dingo. So the sentence is true relative to Cal and false relative to Dingo. So we started with the idea that objects could have person-relative properties. That gave us the idea that the truth value of a proposition would be person-relative. And now we've got sentences expressing those propositions getting person-relative truth values. Okay, so with those preliminaries, we can start thinking about logic and about relations of truth preservation. So the relativism suggests a link to John McFarlane's work on assessment sensitivity. On that view, a truth bearer, like a sentence or a proposition, is going to be assessment sensitive if its truth value depends on features of the context of assessment. If you already know what assessment sensitivity is, you will look at that and think, yep, that seems right. If you don't know what it is, that is not going to explain it to you, but I will have a better example in a minute. But I want to talk about two different formal logics that have a close association with assessment sensitivity, Łukasiewicz's L3 and Kaplan's logic of demonstratives. Okay, so here's the Łukasiewicz part. We are thinking about future contingents. So claims about the future, where what's being claimed about the future isn't necessary, isn't impossible. It could happen, it could not happen, it's contingent. Okay. For example, there will be a space battle tomorrow. So I guess in Aristotle, it's a sea battle, but this is a VR talk, so we're going to go a bit more futuristic. And since this is going to be a future contingent, you could think about the timeline of like what's going to happen as represented like this. So over on the left here, we've got day 0, and then we go one day into the future and we get day 1. And on day 1, Ari utters sentence 2, right? So that's sentence 2 there will be a space battle tomorrow. Throughout this example, you have to imagine that the sentence gets uttered on day 1, right? So the context of use, or the context of utterance for the sentence is always the same. It's always day 1. Right? But then this is contingent, things can go either way, right? And that's represented by this splitting line. So day 2 could go the way it goes above that. There's a space battle. That's what that sort of splodge is. There is a rocket there and some stars. That's the space battle, right? And then day 3 with B there, that's the aftermath of the space battle. But it might not have happened, so we might have taken the bottom line in this diagram. Day 2, no space battle. Day 3, still no space battle. Okay. Łukasiewicz is interested in the truth value of the future contingent. So what's the truth value of 2? And he says this. Well, it can't be true, because if it was true that there would be a space battle tomorrow, then things couldn't go the way they go on the bottom timeline, right? And they can, it's contingent, so it can't be true. But also it can't be false, because then things couldn't go the way they go in the top timeline. So the sentence isn't false, it must be some other truth value. We're going to just call that indeterminate for now as kind of a placeholder for the third truth value. And then he says, well, you know, what happens to a sentence if you negate it, if it was indeterminate to start with? And he has kind of a strong Quine answer for this. The negation of an indeterminate sentence is also indeterminate. And then what happens if you disjoin indeterminate things? same answer, you get another indeterminate sentence. And so the result is that the instance of the law of excluded middle for there will be a space battle tomorrow, namely, there will be a space battle tomorrow, or it's not the case that there will be a space battle tomorrow, that's indeterminate. What's a logical truth? Logical truth is something that's true no matter what, true on every interpretation, true for every instance. Law of excluded middle is not true when we substitute in there will be a space battle tomorrow. So the law of excluded middle is not a law of logic. So we get a non-standard logic in L3. Right? And Macfarlane says, yeah, I get that. I feel that intuition. Right? The truth value of 2 is indeterminate, and yeah, maybe that's a reasonable way to go with the logic. But he's not finished. He's also worried about a different intuition. So Macfarlane says, what about B? So B is over in the future on day 3, and if she asks, what's the truth value of there will be a space battle tomorrow, as said by Ari on day 1, she says, well, Ari said there'd be a space battle on day 2, there was a space battle on day 2, so what Ari said is true. Like, what more could it take? Right? That's just what it is to say true things about the future. So Macfarlane calls this the determinacy intuition. Right? It's the intuition that the truth value of 2, as said by Ari on day 1, is true. The indeterminacy intuition was the one that Łukasiewicz was pushing, that it's really indeterminate. And Macfarlane sets this up as a sort of paradox, right? We've got pressures to say the sentence is indeterminate. We've got pressures to say the sentence is true. And his solution to this is to say that the truth value of the sentence depends on the context of assessment. If you are assessing it from Ari's perspective, so you're standing with Ari, things could go either way, then the sentence is indeterminate, right? There's no truth value for it. But if you're assessing it from B's context of assessment, you're looking back, there was a space battle yesterday, then when Ari said 2 days ago there'll be a space battle tomorrow, Ari said something true. So context of use hasn't changed. In every case, we're assessing what Ari said on day 1, but we're assessing it from 2 different contexts. And what Macfarlane suggests is the truth value of that utterance depends on the context of assessment. Okay? Assessed from day 1, it's indeterminate. Assessed from day 3, it's true. Okay. So, I like the future contingents case for illustrating assessment sensitivity. One of the reasons I like it is it's very vivid and concrete. There's, exploding spaceships. How much more vivid and concrete can you get? Other examples of assessment sensitivity tend to include things like epistemic modals or like different standards of taste, but, exploding spaceships is much clearer and more obvious. I also like it because I think it's plausibly a case where the proposition has changed truth value, not just the sentence. Right? At the beginning, it was indeterminate whether there would be a space battle tomorrow, that there would be a space battle tomorrow. By the end, it's determinately true that there was a space battle. But I don't think that L3 is going to help us with the VR case. One reason is that it differs from the VR case in a key respect, in that the non-classicality comes from indeterminacy. But there isn't any indeterminacy in the virtual reality case with Cal and Dingo. So Cal looks at the balloon, thinks about the sentence, balloon A is red, and it's like, that's true. Dingo looks at it and says, no, that's false, it's blue, right? But for both of them, the sentence gets a determinate truth value. And then if you think about what happens to the law of excluded middle, balloon A is red, or it's not the case that balloon A is red. That's true for Cal, because balloon A is red. But it's also true for Dingo, because he thinks balloon A is not red, right? So you don't get any counterexamples to the law of excluded middle, because we don't have any indeterminacy, okay? All right. Okay, second attempt. different logic that gets associated with assessment sensitivity is Kaplan's logic of demonstratives. Logic of demonstratives is super complicated, and I won't even begin to explain it all now, but here is the gist, right? We're going to try to give a logic for indexicals, words like I, here, now, and actually, and model the contribution that these make to the logic of sentences containing them. So we're going to have a formal language, and it's actually a pretty complicated formal language because it's a formal language for a two-sorted first-order tense modal logic, and then a model theory for that. So there's a lot of stuff in the model theory that gives you truth conditions for all these logical constants, the modals, the tense operators. But then what we add to that is 4 new logical constants, and those are I, H, N, and A for I, here, now, and actually. And then we add stuff to the models that allows us to give special truth conditions for indexicals and make their denotational truth conditions sensitive to context of use, right? So we add some contexts. Our contexts are modeled by these quadruples. We have an agent, a place, a time, and a world. And then we can use those models to give truth conditions for sentences containing the logical constants. So if you have I, that's a term, so it needs to be given a denotation, and its denotation is always going to be the agent from the context. And if you have here, that also picks out something, it picks out a place, and so its denotation is always the place from the context, right? Actually and now are operators instead of terms, so we give their truth conditions in terms of context, times, and worlds. So we're saying that the sentence like actually phi, like say actually it is raining, will be true in some context relative to a time t and a world w, if and only if it is raining is true in that context and that time when you make the world of the context, so the actual world. Okay, so we get these truth conditions that are sensitive to context of use. And then, using these models, we define the logical properties like logical truth, logical consequence. And this is kind of fraught, but in Kaplan, a logical truth is something that's true in all contexts, in all models. And that's a little bit weird because what we've just defined is truth conditions for sentences relative to a context, a time, and a world. And if you've done that, you've got like a recipe. If somebody gives you a time, a world, and a context for figuring out what the truth value is for your sentence. But we need to know when a sentence is true when we've just been given a context, if we're going to make sense of this kind of logical truth. And so Kaplan pulls this like special trick where you say a sentence uttered in the context is true just in case what it says in that context is true in the time and the world of the context. So a context was that quadruple, an agent, a place, a time, and a world. You take that time and a world from the context, and you use those to figure out the truth value of the sentence. And so that's just what that clause is saying. Okay, we get some like distinctively cool logical elements. So for example, phi turns out to be logically equivalent to actually phi. So something in English would be like, it is raining would be logically equivalent to actually it is raining. And the same with now. So it is raining would be logically equivalent to it is raining now, right? And then this is the most famous part. You get some new contingent logical truths, things like the formalization of I am here now, which comes out true in all contexts, even though the proposition it expresses needn't be a necessary one. Because of that, you get failure of necessitation. There are some things that are logical truths, but if you put a box on the front of them, the result is not a logical truth. That's the failure of a sort of neoclassical modal logic principle. And there's an example of how that works there. But you get like a new logic that's different. Okay. It isn't quite what we're going to need for thinking about VR. Here's why. Maybe the most obvious point is that Kaplan's logic is all about sensitivity to context of use, right? If you use the sentence in a different context, then it can get a different truth value. But the VR and relativity-based context sensitivity was all about sensitivity to context of assessment. That is, the context of the person who's assessing the sentence for truth, not just the context where it's said. Okay. And then a different kind of distinction between kinds of context sensitivity is the distinction between indexical and non-indexical context sensitivity. Kaplan's all about indexicals, so you have these expressions that mean different things in different contexts. And so they say different things in different contexts, and so no wonder they can have different truth values in different contexts. But there weren't any indexicals, I don't think, in balloon A is red. Right? What was going on there is it expressed a proposition, and that proposition, that thing it said, could get different truth values relative to different contexts of assessment. Right? That's the non-indexical kind of context sensitivity. So we've got like these 4 different kinds of context sensitivity. Kaplan's all about the use-sensitive indexical kind, but virtual reality seems to be about the assessment-sensitive non-indexical kind. Okay. So let's try actually working out some positive stuff. It's a really common thought that propositions get different truth values relative to different possible worlds. So snow is white, true in the actual world, but if there's a possible world where snow is black, snow is white is false relative to that world. So sometimes people talk about the intention of a proposition. It's a function from possible worlds to truth values, right? The truth value the proposition gets at that world, right? Sometimes people think that propositions get different truth values at different times, as well as at different possible worlds, right? So snow is white now, but if there's some terrible meteorological event and it's black next week, the proposition that snow is white would be true now, but black next week, but false next week, right? And if you like to think of propositions that way, and Kaplan certainly does, then you can think of the intention of a proposition as a function from a world and a time to a truth value. So like, say which possible world it is and what time you're looking at in that possible world, and then the function gives you the truth value for the proposition, given that pair of the world and time. Okay, we're interested in the idea that propositions might get different truth values relative to different people, right? Balloon A is red, true for Cal, false for Dingo. So we're going to need propositions that could get different truth values relative to different people. So for us, an intention is going to be a function from a triple of a world, time, and person to a truth value, right? Sometimes Macfarlane calls propositions like this fancy, right? What makes them fancy is that they're functions from people to truth values, not just from worlds and times. So we're going to have these kinds of fancy propositions. Okay. Now, in LD, Kaplan's logic, the one we've rejected, a sentence is true in a context of use C if the proposition it expresses at C maps the time and world of C to true, right? So that's that trick where we say, where are we getting the world and time from, right? For the proposition from the context, right? But now, we're not just going to have context of use like Kaplan has. We're going to have the context in which the sentence is said, the context of use, but also context of assessment, right? And so the truth value of a sentence is going to depend on both the context of use and the context of assessment, right? So here's the thing that's kind of parallel to what Kaplan does. The sentence phi will be true as used in a context CU and assessed from a context CA if and only if the proposition it expresses at CU is true at, and here's the key, the time and the world of the context of use and the person from the context of assessment, right? We get that just from thinking about the case with like Cal and Dingo and balloon A is red. Like, what's the time and world that matter when he says balloon A is red? It's the time and world where he says it. But what's the person that matters? It's the person of the context of assessment. Okay. Once we've got those fancy propositions and that way of thinking about the truth of sentences, we can introduce operators that are going to shift those parameters. So if we were doing tense logic and modal logic, we could start out with the sentence, balloon A is red. And you might think, well, the truth of that sentence is going to depend on the day and the possible world. Right? There might be some possible worlds in which it's true, some in which it's false, some times at which it's true, but somebody might paint the balloon and then it changes truth value. But you could add an operator like on Friday, balloon A was red. And that forces you to look at the time specified by the operator. So look at Friday and see what color the balloon is then. Right? And then you have something that's not relative anymore. Right? So maybe the balloon is blue on Saturday, but red on Friday, right? So then balloon A is red, true on Friday, false on Saturday, right? But on Friday, balloon A was red. That's just true. True on Friday, true on Saturday, right? So adding that operator like takes out some of the relativity, it kind of derelativizes to time. Similarly, balloon A is red, true in some worlds, false in others, but possibly balloon A is red. All that requires is a some world where balloon A is red, so if it's true relative to any world, it's true relative to them all. So we can do something similar with people. Right? So we could say, for Cal, balloon A is red. And in our setup, that's going to be true for Cal, but also true for Dingo. Right? Because it's saying, okay, fix the person to be Cal, and now see what color the balloon is. It's red for Cal, so the sentence is true for Cal, also true for Dingo. Okay. So we can give some truth clauses, which I'm not going to linger on for those expressions. You get for Cal coming out as a kind of derelativizer. We had this sentence, balloon A is red, different truth values relative to different people, but for Cal, balloon A is red is not like that. And we can also add like the equivalent of like universal quantifiers or existential quantifiers. For everyone, balloon A is red, or for someone, balloon A is red. It's a bit like the necessity operator and the possibility operator, but this time it's over people instead of over possible worlds, right? When you do that, you get results in the logic that seem non-standard to me. So, for example, I think if we're in the real world and we have for Cal, balloon A is red, it would follow that for everyone, balloon A is red, right? Also, if for someone, balloon A is red, it would follow that for Cal, balloon A is red, because in the real world, the truth value of balloon A is red doesn't vary among people. But in VR, balloon A is red can be true for Cal, and it doesn't follow that it's true for everyone. Right? So that entailment fails. Okay. Last kind of interesting logical expression that we can add. In Kaplan's logic, we don't just have like a necessity operator and a possibility operator. We have indexical modal operators like actually, right? In the actual world, something is the case. So in addition to having like for Cal or for everyone or for someone, you could have an indexical operator that is for me, balloon A is red, right? So we can set that up, give it some semantics, and that has a distinctive effect on the logic that is a little bit like what you get in the logic of demonstratives. So in the logic of demonstratives, it is raining is true if and only if it is raining now. Right? Also, it is raining is true if and only if actually it is raining. And in this logic, oops, I'm trying to go back, we can look at the claim balloon A is red for me, right? And balloon A is red, right? And ask whether that is logically equivalent. Okay, sorry, I keep going back. All right, there is a slightly tricky question here about how you define logical truth. So we've looked at how to define truth relative to a context of utterance and a context of assessment. But what does it take for a sentence to be a logical truth? And one of the things Macfarlane says is there's at least two tempting, natural things that you could look at. One is what he calls absolute logical truth. And a sentence is an absolute logical truth if, for absolutely any context of utterance and context of assessment, it comes out true. Right? But there's another, tighter notion, which is a sentence such that for any context of use, if you assess it from the context in which it's used, it will come out true. Right? And we have this question, what do we want to be the notion of logical truth? What do we want to be the notion of logical consequence in the logic? I don't really know what the answer to that question is yet. But one thing that you might try to do is look at some sentences that are diagonal logical truths, but not absolute logical truths. And ask yourself, does that seem like a logical truth? Right, so I've got an example for you. Macfarlane doesn't think we need to choose between them, but Macfarlane said that in other contexts where I disagree with him. Okay, here's the last logic-y thing. Here is that equivalence. So for me, balloon A is red if and only if balloon A is red. That is a diagonal logical truth, but not an absolute logical truth. So imagine, you're in VR, you're looking at the balloon, right? For me, balloon A is red is only going to be true if you're looking at the balloon and it's red, right? But that will make balloon A is red true as well, relative to you as the assessor, right? But also, if it's true relative to you as the assessor, then it's going to, for me, P is going to come out true. However, it's not an absolute logical truth because if the context of use and the context of assessment come apart, it can be false. So Dingo is listening to me say, for me, balloon A is red, and he says, that's true, right? Because for me, right, I'm looking at the balloon A is red. If and only if balloon A is red, but Dingo looks at the balloon and says, oh, it's not, right? Balloon A is not red. So that equivalence doesn't hold when you assess from a different context from the context of use, right? So not an absolute logical truth, but it is a diagonal logical truth. Okay. Hopefully that has given you enough to think about, that those of you who find it interesting to think about logic might think, yeah, there's something a bit non-classical about what would go on with the logic for VR. But I wanted to finish up with something that's much bigger picture. So in this talk, I've assumed a certain view about the metaphysics of virtual reality. So I've said things like, virtual reality balloons can have person-relative properties. For example, red for Cal, blue for Dingo. But although I made that assumption, and on the basis of that assumption said, so we need an assessment-sensitive logic, you might challenge that antecedent to the conditional, right? So here are some alternatives. You might be a VR skeptic, by which I mean that you're a skeptic about the objects that you find in virtual reality, right? And so you say, there is no balloon, right? If you're playing tennis in virtual reality and you're knocking a ball back and forth, you might have been talking about the ball, but there is no ball. And so there's no object that has person-relative properties, and so we don't need this logic because that's not something that's going on in the metaphysics, right? Here's another thing you might say instead. So it's like a third view. You might be a VR pluralist. It's not that there's no balloon, it's not that there's one balloon, you think there's two, or at least two, right? There's one balloon, let's say, in Cal's headset, and one balloon that's in Dingo's headset. One of those balloons is red, one of them is blue, but there is no one object that has different properties relative to different people, okay? So, I don't want to express too much confidence here. I like the view on which VR contains virtual objects. Virtual objects exist, and they can have person-relative properties. But I think there's a real philosophical conversation to be had about what is the correct metaphysics of VR. Maybe it's a pluralist one, maybe it's a sort of skeptical one, maybe it's the one I like. But the last point that I wanted to make is that Quine, in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, has some stuff to say that seems to bear on this issue. Right? So we started out with Quinean epistemology of logic, so it's striking there is a Quinean case to be made for the existence of VR objects. So here's Quine. As an empiricist, I continue to think of the conceptual scheme of science as a tool, ultimately, for predicting future experience in the light of past experience. Physical objects are conceptually imported into the situation as convenient intermediaries, not by definition in terms of experience, but simply as irreducible posits comparable epistemologically to the gods of Homer. So what exists on Quine's view is what is posited by our best theories for predicting and explaining experience. If you spend time in VR, then positing the existence of VR objects is useful for predicting and explaining what they do. It's much easier to play tennis in VR if you're thinking of that thing as an object that exists. And the more time we spend in VR, the more useful positing the existence of VR objects is for explaining our experience, because so much more of our experience is experience that is generated in VR. So yeah, the more time we spend in VR, the more these kinds of experiences are core experiences in our lives, and so the more useful it is to posit the existence of VR objects. At the limit, if we live our whole lives in virtual reality, then the Quinean case for positing VR objects is exactly as strong as the regular case for positing normal physical objects. I've been arguing for the conditional that if VR relativism is true, we need an assessment-sensitive logic. But if we combine this Quinean case with my conditional, as our use of VR grows, so grows the empirical case for revising our logic. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So, does this work? Yeah. So thank you very much for your talk. So we have about 20 minutes now for Q&A. So please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, so let's start with Gerhard Schulz. Can you? Just wait for the microphone, please, Gerhard. Yeah.
Thank you for your nice talk, Gillian.
Thank you.
So my question is, you don't need to go to virtual reality. Think about propositions whose truth value is subjective anyway, like about taste, like chocolate is tasty, beef is tasty, tomato are tasty. Think about the logic of these propositions. Then isn't it just structurally similar? You could apply your personal relative assessment just to these propositions. So, or is there any difference to the virtual reality? Isn't it just the same? That's my question. Yeah.
Okay, good, yes. It is very much the way I set the talk up, right? No relativity in the real world. Obvious relativity in virtual reality. So like, here's an argument for using McFarlane's style logic. I like to give the talk that way because I think it's like clearer. But in fact, I'm not so confident about the no relativity in the real world part of it. So one thing that you might worry about is, yeah, exactly the kind of cases that motivate McFarlane. So taste, epistemic modals, future contingents. All those cases are controversial. And I think in some ways it's as if McFarlane, found some relativism around the edges of the world and like very abstract things and like maybe some very personal things like taste. And one of the things I like about the virtual reality case is it's the distance between the bottom of the balloon and the ground, this very like fundamental property that you can see. And so I particularly like this case, like it's sort of shocking. It's like, even people who didn't think we found any relativism in the real world, it's like we constructed a world that had relativism built in, and so we made it true ourselves. But in fact, I'm not very sure what to think about the taste cases, whether we should go with assessment-sensitive solutions. I don't know enough about epistemic modals to be sure about those cases. So yeah, you might be right that there's already some relativism in the real world.
Okay, thank you. Next one is Barbara Vetter. So G10, the the seat number.
Thank you, Gillian. That was really amazing. I had the kind of metaphysical things in mind throughout the talk, so you sort of almost answered my question, so I just want to push a little bit more on it. I was thinking the whole time, this looks like the world that the phenomenalist would think we're living in, right? It feels like there's just sense data. And then when you quoted Quine in the end, and you said Quine's case for physical objects applies to VR objects, I thought, well, there is one difference, and that's precisely the difference that you were pointing out. One really good case for positing physical objects is that they appear the same to you and to me. They're sort of not personal, but interpersonal. We can coordinate on them. Anything that appears only to me is probably a hallucination. Or anything that appears, as you said earlier, right? That's exactly the point. You said in the real world, if the balloon looks to be on the ground to me and 200 meters up to you, something went wrong. And that's precisely why we think the balloon is a real object. And then I think maybe that case could be made even not just for the objects, but for the properties too. If you think there's a balloon there, does it really have the property of being red or blue or 200 meters up or not? Or does it only have the property of appearing red to me and blue to you, or 200 meters up to you and down on the ground to me? So I don't know if I want to endorse any of these things, but I thought the sort of coordinating among different agents aspect seems a really important part of stipulating real objects, and that sort of seems to be at least only partly true in the virtual reality case.
Yeah, no, that seems true. So it definitely, there's all these things that we talk about already in philosophy that we might compare virtual reality to, like dreams or fictions or being deceived by evil demons or like all kinds of things. And then, it has some features that make it seem especially interesting, or they're just special, right? And then like one of them is this social aspect, that you can be there with someone else and then you can like interact with the same object and act, of course, that's like very distinctive. And have your rational faculties, awake and so be thinking about it. And I mean, one of the things you said is that, it makes sense to posit the existence of these things to the extent that they seem the same to us. and they help us coordinate. And of course, being different colors or different distances is breaking from that ideal of being the same. And the more extreme it gets, the less likely I think we're going to want to posit that this is one object. So, if it was a different color and also in a different place and a different shape, and right at some point we're just not going to feel any temptation to talk about this as one object. And so are we starting to already slide towards that with the relativism? Maybe, I think so. But on the other hand, if we're playing tennis, all kinds of things about the ball are important for our coordinating, like its position and how it responds to being hit by the bat or something like that. But color might not be one of them. And if one of us is a little worse at seeing things in dim light, we might make the ball luminous for them or something, or for kids or something, we might do pretty colors. And I think we'd still feel pretty tempted to talk about it as the same object. So I think it's a really striking point. And what I'm tempted to say about it is it's really going to depend on how chaotic it gets and how much it affects our coordination. But maybe in the cases where it doesn't affect it that much, it won't sort of undermine the motivation to talk about it as existing.
Thank you.
Okay, can you pass over the microphone to the gentleman in F03? Yes.
Hello? Yes, I have questions about the ontological foundations of the virtual realities, because for me it more seems like the fictional reality rather than the virtual reality, because for virtual reality it's determined by the data and by the bit of the programs. So it has ontological foundations. It's determined by the real world. So if we want to know the bonus is a blue, we can check the code of the programs of the virtual realities. So I'm not sure. Do you think about that will influence your studies, the ontological aspect?
So I'm not sure I completely got all the question. It was partly about virtual reality objects as fiction and the comparison to that.
Because the virtual reality is determined by the data, by the programs. So it's designed by the programmers. So it has kind of the ontological foundation in the real world.
Okay, and so that would be a reason to say that they exist?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, this I think is very sympathetic with Dave Chalmers' view of virtual objects.
Reality Plus, right?
Sorry?
I mean the David Chalmers, the famous book, the Reality Plus.
Yeah, in Reality Plus. So, I mean, one of the things he says is that it turns out that the underlying nature of virtual objects is just a bit different, right? It turns out to have a underlying software nature. They're digital objects. But the underlying nature of physical objects turned out to be very different from what we thought. They're quantum objects in some sense. And when you understand them, that's also very surprising. And so we should just think that virtual objects are a different kind of objects that really exist, but that we can interact with. Certainly, if we wanted to find out more about our virtual objects, we could look more into their underlying nature, and that might mean looking at the code, right? And presumably it's going to turn out at some point that some aspect of that code triggered the result that the balloon is red for Cal and blue for Dingo. And so we'd be able to find an explanation for that. That seems right.
Okay.
So the next one are, 130 and 131. And try to be brief, because I think I have 8 more people on the list.
No, we don't. What? Okay, I just have to speak now. It's turned off, but yeah.
Should work.
Okay, yeah, so playing a game with the ball that looks different to different people happens to me all the time because I'm very colorblind. And it doesn't seem to be that we have problems then thinking that, you know, did the ball kind of go into the net or did it just go over it? It's kind of not really an issue. And I think a lot what towards the ontology in the end, like the shared nature of it, I think that really neatly kind of suggested that, well, look, there is this one object. That's how we coordinate around things. But moving from the kind of spatial location to color, I think that's actually an issue there. Because if it turns out that my partner and I see that, oh, the ball really went over the net or really went into it, then we're wondering, are we seeing the same ball? So it seems that spatial location really is quite important for us to individuate objects, while things like color are not. And it might be that the kind of personal relativity at the edges of the world, as you call it, that might be all that a shared world can take. And once you put more personal relativity in it, at some point we're not seeing the same object.
Yeah, no, but that's really interesting because I definitely found it especially exciting that it was properties like distance that seem so basic, that were varying from person to person. But you're right, if we were playing tennis, that could really break everything, right? We're not gonna be able to coordinate. But I wonder the extent to which this is gonna depend on what we're doing, So if we're trying to, jointly move something to a certain place, and location is very important, but if we're watching a fireworks show and one of us is overwhelmed by too many lights and it's just too much, and you would fix it to make it in a smaller section for us, then we might be happy to say we're watching the same fireworks show, but I'm watching it on just a reduced version. That's a really interesting insight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that entertaining and thought-provoking talk. As someone who likes to play with logical systems and wasting more and more time in virtual reality, I liked it very much. But here it is, I don't share your intuition that we have a shared world here with person relative properties, and my question goes into the same direction, and we did not chat. So to me, it feels much more natural to describe the collective experience in VR as taking place in partially overlapping virtual realities. That picture would then allow us to preserve some common understanding of identity, right, of objects and worlds, because we have these properties that seem to matter, that don't fall apart for the same object, right? So could you elaborate maybe why you actually prefer that, so beyond intuition, right? That it feels more natural to you, and for me it feels more natural that we have a shared, we have a non-shared but partially overlapping world, but still that would somehow preserve a kind of revisionary metaphysical experience, right? So having overlapping possible worlds and no shared reality. So maybe you can elaborate on why you prefer actually this picture of the one shared world.
I mean, I don't know that I have anything especially interesting to say about that, but the overlapping approach, doesn't that mean that part of the world would be shared? I'm trying to understand what overlapping would be without there being some part of the world that's shared. It sounds like part of the world is the same, and then we also each have a bit that's different.
Yeah, so we both share, or our worlds are overlapping or synchronous in the sense that we're both being in a similar environment, right?
Okay, so we share the room.
We share parts of the world, right? So this is a question: is in there one world that contains two separate worlds, or is there two separate worlds? I would say we have both two different virtual realities, but they are partially synchronized and partially not.
I don't think I have some knockdown answer for why I prefer this particular approach, except, pointing to the sort of Quinean style. This is going to help us predict and explain, and also, I think with Quine, we can ask a question about like whose experience we're trying to explain, like whose data. And then is it just mine that I want to make sense of, or is it mine and the people who are in VR with me, or the whole society, like who sometimes plugs into VR and sometimes doesn't? But I mean, it does seem like a much simpler way to explain what's going on when I'm playing virtual tennis, that there's one ball and we're knocking it back and forth. Like it gets really complicated if you start thinking, well, one person's getting these visual stimuli and this other person's getting these other visual stimuli. And I mean, it's hard to do without saying as if they're interacting with a ball.
Me.
Yeah.
How can Cal and Dingo agree? Suppose they both say the balloon is red, and the proposition that that sentence expresses in Cal's context of use and Cal's context of assessment is the same as the proposition it expresses in Dingo's context of use and Dingo's context of assessment. That is, when each of them says it expresses the same function from world, time, person, or perspective triples to truth values. But when Cal says it, she says it because she thinks that when you plug in the actual world and the current time and her perspective, out comes truth. And when Dingo says it, he says it because he thinks that when you plug in the actual world, the present time, and his perspective, out comes truth. And I wonder whether that counts as agreeing.
Yeah, right. It's a good question. I mean, there's a parallel with like times in context of assessment, right? So if it were possible for people to talk across different times, we have like a trans-time telephone, right? Then one person could say, oh yes, this event happened in like 1951. And somebody says, oh yes, that event happened in 1951. But if that means, you know, is true relative to their context of assessment and true relative to the other context of assessment, are they actually agreeing? Yeah, so I don't know that it's very obvious what would count as agreement here. Like the natural thing to go is attributing to the same truth value to the same proposition, right? But when you have propositions whose truth values vary with these things, it's not clear what to do. I mean, one thing that if Cal and Dingo, you know, were thinking about this sort of way they could go is to say, go to the derelativized proposition. So Cal says, you know, for me, balloon A is red. And Dingo says, that's right, for you, balloon A is red, right? They can agree in a very straightforward sense that way by fixing the person. And so I suppose somebody could say, okay, it was assessed from 1986. This event happened in 1951. And somebody else could say, yes, assessed from 2025. This event happened in 1951. And then that would be a clear case of agreement. But it's much harder to say what it would be for the proposition where you haven't done that yet.
Okay, thank you. So next one is Stefano Pugnagi.
So thanks for the talk. So my concern goes roughly in the direction that they all touched. I wanted to explore more your rejection of the Kaplan indexical idea.
Oh yeah.
And so instead of focusing on the objects themselves, I was thinking, so what would you say to some cases that seems to be genuinely possible in the case of VR? Something like, you know, take a balloon A, call it just A for simplicity. It might happen that A is a balloon in your virtual reality and a Zeppelin or a plane in my virtual reality. And also cases like, so in virtual reality it seems even possible to somehow modify the framing. So something like, it was inspired by there's a sea battle tomorrow. You might have a 15-hour-long day in a virtual reality setting. The statement, tomorrow is something is happening, might end up meaning different things in the mouth of two different speakers, depending on how fast the day-night transition is going to happen. So I was wondering, so whether these cases don't speak for an indexical picture rather than a change in proposition rather than an assessment sensitivity.
Okay, let me make sure that I'm sort of on the right page with you. So one of the thoughts was, it might not just be that the objects are different colors, they might be different kinds of thing. And you could certainly imagine that if we played a game, right? So your daughter might like it with like the creatures as dinosaurs, but your son might like it if they're My Little Ponies or something. And so the creature that's winning the race, right? Is it a dinosaur or is it a My Little Pony, right? I suppose that's exactly the kind of case where I'm just happy to say it's a dinosaur relative to her and a My Little Pony relative to him. If the kind of thing it was more important to what we were doing, we might have to start saying this is a case where the coordination is just not working and we don't want to say there's a single object. But I think that's sort of on the spectrum of the sort of breakdown that I was talking about with Barbara Vetter. But the question's partly about indexicals, right? There is some respect in which I was actually a bit fast when I said, LD isn't going to work for VR because that's about use-sensitive indexicals, and we're interested in non-indexical assessment sensitivity. Because, of course, there was use sensitivity in my language as well. And, in fact, Kaplan's language has some non-indexical use sensitivity, although we don't talk about it as much, and it wasn't his main focus. And there's no reason, this is too fast. Maybe you could have assessment-sensitive indexicals. That is, expressions that meant something different, like had different content relative to different contexts of assessment. So Macfarlane occasionally suggests something like that, and it's not his main focus, but it's something we could try adding to the language and then seeing how it would go. I didn't want to make this any more complicated, so I haven't done anything like that here. But the break between LD and what I'm doing here is not as clean as I made it out to be. That's true.
Okay, next question, Max Gröbel.
Hi, Gillian. I just wanted to get back to the main theme of the talk, the question of revising logic, and wanted to ask, so what did you have in mind are the revisions that VR force us or suggest that we make? Because you only briefly mentioned this question of how we should define logical truth. But you said, is there any logical principle that we should change? As far as I can see, at least in Macfarlane's
so let me go back a few slides.
Anything logically very unusual.
Okay. Sorry, I will bring it back to your thing in a minute. So one issue where the logic starts to get interesting is these like for everyone operators and for Cal. So I think in the real world, if balloon A is red, it follows that balloon A is red for everyone. And if it's red for someone, it follows that it's red for Cal. But with this kind of relativity, you don't get those entailments. But then another place where it's interesting is this for me operator. And things like for me phi, if and only if phi. That I think is going to interact in interesting ways with the sort of generalization that you'll get things that can come out as logical truths, even though putting for everyone on the front is not itself a logical truth, which kind of parallels the move with necessitation in the logic of demonstrative stuff. And then the last thing is just this stuff about the sentences like this, which are not absolute logical truths, but if Macfarlane is right that it doesn't matter which of these we pick, we can have both, like absolute logical truth and diagonal logical truth, then we're going to have these, that's already kind of non-standard logic, right? But with something like this, like, you might wonder, like, what logic is supposed to be for, right? If it's logical consequence and you've got something that's true, right? Should it be the case that the conclusion has to be true? In your context, assessed from where it's used, or does it have to be true from where everybody else assesses it as well? And so this question, like, do you think of yourself when you're doing logic as kind of on your own in your study, you've got some true stuff and you're going to try to work out some more true stuff? Or do you think of it as something that you publish in a journal that other people are going to look at and, like, they are going to start with premises that are true for them as well? And should that entailment give them something that is true from their context of assessment as well? So I think there's, like, some interesting logical stuff there.
Okay, yes, your question, please.
Yeah, I have a question why you chose person as a third category, because I'm here, sorry.
Hey, thanks.
Because how you described it in the VR situation, it could also be that, for example, you said it about your own experience, right? Like if somebody would switch the goggles with you, maybe they would have the very same perspective, or even if nobody would watch and there would just be a chair, maybe the chair would also see the same kind of thing. So I was wondering why you chose person.
You thought the chair would see something?
For example, like if there were no person to observe, it could still be that the virtual reality would stand for itself in that way that from one point of view it would be blue and from another it would be red. Like it was just an example.
Okay, yeah, no, cool thought experiment, right? What about if we just switch headsets? So I've been assuming that it's relative to person, like the color of the object or the distance of the object. I think really that's sort of a placeholder for whatever it's relative to, and I'm not sure that it shouldn't be something like relative to headset or relative to like instance of the software or something like this. I think maybe like thought experiments like yours are things that we should use to try and decide which is right. I mean, you can imagine somebody says, "Oh yeah, they look like they're pink to me. Do you want to see?" And then takes the headset off and shows them, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that is pink." And then do you say for me, or do you mean in that instance, or in that headset? Yeah, I'm not sure what the right way to get more precise is. Yeah, but I think you're right that like it needs to get more refined.
So it would be more about perception and less about perspective in a way.
I don't know.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to stop here. So sorry for those who wanted to ask more questions. Yeah, so thank you very much, Gillian, for your talk, and thank you for your questions.
Yeah.
Right. This marks... Hello, can we get this microphone? I take this one. This marks the end of the academic part of GAP 12. But don't be sad just yet. We continue tomorrow and Saturday with our satellite workshops and continue also next week with our asteroid summer school. And of course, tonight is our party at ZAK, the Center for Alternative Art and Culture. Over 350 tickets have been sold already, but don't worry, you can get your ticket at the box office for 10 euros. Now, the full address, pathways to and from the party, the full address You have it in your app, of course, but this is the best way to go from here, from university to the ZAK. You would take the subway or tram U79 from Universität Ostbotanischer Garten and then go to the station Oberbilker Markt. From there, it's only 10 minutes by foot to the ZAK. Before heading there, make sure you grab something to eat because there's no food at the venue. However, if you leave at Oberbilker Markt, there's right away Kölner Straße, where you will find plenty of fast food options and restaurants. Now, when you get back home or to the hotel at 3 o'clock, because that's when we finish, hope you stay that long, it would be a 20 minutes or 19 minutes walking distance to the main station, for example, Düsseldorf main station. From my own impression, it's safe to walk the route and use Düsseldorf's main station at night. That should be okay. Still, maybe it feels safer if you leave and return to your hotels in smaller groups. That's from my side. And
yeah, I also wanted to encourage you to give us some feedback on this conference. So I think this would be very much interesting for us, but I mean also for the next GAP board. So let us just know what you liked and what we could maybe improve for future GAP congresses. So yeah, please come to us. Yeah, and also I guess we will see many of you again later at the party. I mean, yeah, we would like to wish you now a safe journey home and hope we will all see you again in 3 years at the GAP 13 in Göttingen. So.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for being part of GAP and see you tonight. Bye-bye.